The ghost of Lena's smile, the smell of rain, the fleeting joy of a shared meal they were pulled from his mind, replaced by a crystalline, hollow clarity. He felt his pulse slow to a rhythmic, mechanical beat. Every muscle in his frame tightened, not from fear, but from the sudden acquisition of a predator's instinct. He reached out and gripped the edges of the fracture, pulling the light into his own chest. The void shuddered. Around him, the darkness began to fold, collapsing inward like paper caught in a fire. KL did not look back. He watched as his own history burned away, the threads of his past severed by his own hand. He traded the illusion of love for the architecture of control. His eyes, once clouded by uncertainty, now burned with a cold, piercing precision. He stood at the threshold of his own rebirth, prepared to dismantle the world that had cast him aside. He stepped through the light. The void vanished. The silence was absolute. The air in the room was thick with the smell of recycled water and metallic dust. KL opened his eyes. The ceiling leaked, a slow, rhythmic drip hitting a plastic basin. It was 24 hours before the fall. He sat up, his movements fluid and devoid of the hesitation that had defined his life. He looked at his hands. The oil stains were gone, yet he could still feel the phantom weight of the tools he had not yet repaired. He stood. His balance was perfect, recalibrated to the millimeter. He walked to the window and pressed his palm against the glass. The city outside pulsed with the same neon flicker, but the chaotic blur had sharpened into a predictable grid of power nodes and surveillance paths. He did not look for Lena. He did not check the kitchen for food. Instead, he traced the structural weaknesses in the apartment wall with his gaze, calculating the force required to breach them. Every heartbeat felt like a gear clicking into place. He was not the man who had lived here yesterday. He turned away from the window, his expression a flat, unyielding line. He dressed, his motions efficient, ignoring the trembling of the floorboards beneath him. The countdown had begun, and he was no longer a victim of the clock, but its architect. KL stepped into the factory. The air was heavy with the scent of ozone and grinding metal. Machines groaned, echoing through the cavernous space, but he did not flinch. He walked the aisle toward his workstation, his stride measured and silent. A coworker stepped into his path, gesturing toward a broken terminal, but KL pivoted around him without breaking his pace or offering a glance. The man stared, confused, but KL was already focused on the assembly line ahead. He reached his bench. Discarded drones lay in heaps, yet he did not see junk. He saw circuits, power cells, and salvageable components mapped in a three-dimensional grid in his mind. He picked up a soldering iron. His hands moved with terrifying speed, stitching wires and bypassing locks in seconds. He ignored the flickering neon lights and the rhythmic thrum of the city above the ceiling. His attention was locked on the architecture of his own survival. He disassembled a navigation unit, extracted the core, and set it aside not for repair, but for later use. Every motion served a hidden, larger purpose. He did not seek comfort in the work. He sought leverage. He worked until the metal under his fingers hummed, his gaze fixed on the shadows, systematically preparing for the collapse he knew was coming. KL exited the factory as the rain began to slick the rusted walkways. He bypassed the main thoroughfares, moving through the narrow, unlit gaps between buildings where the city surveillance could not reach. He arrived at a subterranean data exchange, a place where information held more value than currency. 3 brokers stood near a flickering terminal, arguing over a decrypted access key. KL stepped into the light, his presence unannounced. He pulled a single, salvaged power cell from his pocket, the component he had extracted during his shift. He slid it across the metal table. The brokers stopped. He did not speak. He pointed to the terminal, tapped a sequence into the keypad, and watched as the system bypassed the security encryption entirely. The brokers exchanged nervous glances, recognizing the value of the exploit. KL accepted a heavy data shard in return, a key to a dormant bank account hidden in the city's infrastructure. He walked back into the shadows, his hands steady, his path clear. He spent the next 3 hours cycling through 5 different drop points, laundering the digital credits into untraceable assets. By the time he reached a secluded maintenance vault beneath the industrial district, He possessed enough capital to buy the loyalty of the local sector guards. He locked the heavy iron door behind him. The vault was empty, cold, and silent. It was the foundation of a new empire, built in the dark, far from the gaze of those who thought they owned the city. Kale sat in his vault, the glow of 6 monitors washing over his face. He fed the data shards into the local network, triggering a cascade of pre-planned errors. Across the city, Valther's primary supply chain froze. Kale watched the real-time logistics map. Every shipment marked with Valther's seal stalled at the perimeter. The automated ports shut down, locked by a command sequence Kale had injected hours prior. He shifted to a secondary feed showing Valther's executive office. The feed was grainy, but clear enough to see the movement. Valther paced the length of the glass wall, his hands gesticulating wildly at a wall of holographic displays. A micro-turn occurred when an aide rushed in, holding a tablet that displayed the plummeting stock values. Valther grabbed the device, slammed it against the floor, and shoved the aide toward the door. Panic was no longer a theory. It was visible in the frantic, uncoordinated movements of the security staff gathering in the lobby. Kale entered the final command. The connection severed, leaving Valther's digital empire in total darkness. He stood up, walked to the ventilation grate, and looked out at the distant glimmer of the upper city. The cracks were forming. Valther's reach was shrinking, his influence bleeding away into the grid Kale now controlled. Kale did not smile. He simply watched the lights flicker and die, one sector at a time. Kale was working on a terminal when the heavy iron door of the vault groaned. He did not look up. Lena stepped into the room, her movements hesitant, her eyes searching his face for a flicker of recognition. She walked toward the desk, her boots echoing against the metal floor. She stopped 3 feet away. Kale continued to input code, his fingers dancing across the keys with clinical precision. She spoke his name, a soft sound that failed to displace the hum of the cooling fans. Kale ignored the vibration in the air. She took another step, reaching out to touch the edge of his workstation, but he shifted his position by a fraction of an inch, ensuring no physical contact occurred. The micro-turn came when she grabbed the back of his chair, forcing him to stop. He stood up slowly, turned his head toward her and looked through her as if she were a ghost. His eyes were flat, empty of the warmth that had once been his defining trait. He walked past her toward the exit, his pace steady and indifferent. Lena stood alone in the center of the vault. She called out again, but the heavy door slammed shut, cutting off her voice. Outside, Kyle disappeared into the rain, leaving her with nothing but the sound of her own breathing in the dark. The final data package hit the public servers at midnight. Kyle watched from his terminal as the files propagated across every screen in the upper city. They were not just numbers. They were logs of every bribe, every forced eviction, and every life discarded for profit. Within minutes, the fallout was visible. Valther's personal security detail abandoned their posts at the main gates. Kale monitored the feed as Valther emerged from his office, his face pale, shouting orders at empty hallways. He reached for his comlink, but the network access was already severed. A micro-turn occurred when Valther tried to force his way into the executive boardroom. 2 of his former partners stepped forward, blocking his path with cold, calculated movements. They did not speak. They simply pointed toward the service elevator. Valther retreated, his bravado replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered man. He scrambled down the maintenance stairs, passing rows of technicians who stared at him as if he were a ghost. By the time he reached the lower levels, his private transport had been impounded by the authorities. He stood on the street, the neon lights reflecting in the puddles at his feet. KL watched from the shadows of a nearby balcony, seeing the man who once held the city in his grip now just another face lost in the rain-slicked crowd. The Empire had not fallen with a roar. It had simply ceased to exist. Valther did not look back when he left the penthouse. He simply walked toward the transport bay, his pace brisk, leaving Lena alone amidst the glass and chrome. She stood by the viewport, her hand pressed against the cool surface, watching the golden lights of the skyscrapers flicker as the power grid surged. She moved to the door, expecting to follow, but the panel flashed red. Access denied. A security drone hovered into the foyer, its red sensor pulsing in time with the city's heartbeat. It emitted a sharp, metallic chirp and gestured toward the service lift. She tried to override the lock, her fingers dancing over the interface, but the data had been wiped. Her influence had vanished along with Valther's authority. The lift doors slid open, revealing a cramped, greasy shaft. She stepped inside, the descent lasting an eternity as the air grew thick with the familiar, suffocating scent of ozone and rot. When the doors opened again, she was back in the slums. The street level was a maze of rusted pipes and slick, black puddles. She walked toward the apartment they had once shared, but the door was already hanging off its hinges, scavengers stripping the wiring from the walls. Her past was gone. The golden dreams she had chased were nothing more than ash, scattered by the relentless, freezing rain of the lower city. The rooftop was a flat expanse of rusted metal, slick with the constant, biting rain of the lower city. Kyle stood near the edge, his boots anchored to the grating. He watched the horizon, where the neon haze of the city flickered against the dark clouds. He did not turn when the heavy door groaned open. Lena stepped out, her movements jagged, her balance failing as she stepped onto the uneven surface. She stopped 10 paces behind him, her hands trembling as she reached out to steady herself against a ventilation pipe. The wind whipped between them, carrying the metallic scent of rust and the harsh, chemical sting of the smog. Kyle turned slowly. His face was a mask of calculated indifference. Lena looked at him, but her gaze did not linger. It drifted to the abyss beyond the railing, as if searching for the ghost of the life she had sacrificed. The distance between them was only a few meters, but the air felt thin, charged with the weight of every lie they had lived. Neither spoke. The rain hammered against the metal roof, filling the space where words should have been. Their histories were written in the exhaustion etched into their posture. They were no longer the two people who had shared a cramped apartment in the dark. They were strangers, bound by the wreckage of their own choices. The rain intensified, turning the rooftop into a landscape of dark, mirrored surfaces. Kale tracked the way the water channeled through the rusted vents, his focus entirely on the mechanics of the structure. Beside him, Lena remained motionless. She stared at the horizon, her breathing shallow, the rhythm of her lungs out of sync with his own. Every time she shifted her weight, the metal grating groaned under her feet, a jarring sound in the steady drone of the downpour. Kale moved a single step closer, but the action felt forced, an empty gesture toward a connection that had ceased to exist. He watched the way her hands gripped the cold railing, knuckles white, yet she did not look at him. The silence was not a pause in conversation. It was a physical barrier. It was the sound of everything they had been, dissolving into the grime of the city. He looked at her profile and saw only the exhaustion of a survivor, stripped of the warmth he once knew. She turned her head slightly, her gaze catching his for a fraction of a second, before she looked back into the void of the city lights. There was no recognition in her eyes, only a profound, hollow stillness. They were two remnants of a broken timeline, existing in the same space, yet drifting further apart with every drop of rain that fell between them. A hum began beneath their feet. It was not a sound, but a vibration that traveled through the soles of their boots and settled in their marrow. Kale felt the metal grating shudder. He gripped the railing, his knuckles tightening as the frequency increased, turning from a dull thrum into a bone-rattling pulse. Lena staggered, her hands flying out to catch the edge of a ventilation duct to stay upright. The rain around them seemed to hang suspended in the air, caught in the invisible, oscillating waves of energy. They both looked down, searching for the source in the city below, but the slums were silent. The neon lights were flickering in perfect, rhythmic synchronization with the vibration. Then, the sound shifted. A high-pitched whine cut through the low-frequency drone, sounding like metal being stretched to the point of snapping. Kale looked up. The clouds above were no longer drifting. They were roiling, folding back on themselves like liquid lead. The very air felt heavy, pressing down on their shoulders with an unnatural density. Lena gasped, her breath hitching as the vibration reached a crescendo that made the teeth ache. The sky was no longer a canopy of smog and shadow. It was a membrane, and it was beginning to tear. A jagged fissure of white light cut across the zenith, cauterizing the smog. The clouds did not simply drift apart. They were shredded by an unseen force, pulled back like curtains of heavy, dark fabric. Kale shielded his eyes, the skin of his palms stinging as the radiance intensified. The light carried no warmth. It was sterile, clinical, and so bright it erased the neon glow of the lower slums instantly. He looked toward the horizon, and his breath caught. The golden skyscrapers, the pinnacles of wealth and power that once dominated the skyline, were suddenly rendered insignificant. They appeared as fragile, miniature carvings against the backdrop of the opening void. Lena fell to her knees, her fingers clawing at the rusted rooftop, as the sky continued to expand. A roar, vast and guttural, erupted from the rift, vibrating through the structural steel of the entire district. The metallic groan of the city buildings echoed the sound of the atmosphere being peeled away. Everything that defined the horizon was being dismantled by the sheer pressure of the light. Cale stared into the brilliance, his pupils contracting into pinpricks. The sky was no longer a barrier, it was an entrance, and the magnitude of what lay behind it turned the world below into a forgotten, dusty nursery. The light stabilized into a rigid, geometric border. It was not a tear in the sky anymore, but a structure. A frame of obsidian and pulsing violet energy stretched across the entire horizon, wider than the city itself. Its edges were perfectly straight, defying the organic chaos of the clouds. Cale watched as the gate began to rotate, a slow, grinding motion that sent shockwaves through the air, flattening the rain into a fine, suspended mist. The noise of Nocterus Prime, the hum of the factories, the distant sirens, the constant thrum of the turbines vanished. Silence rushed into the vacuum, heavy and absolute. Lena stood up, her movements stiff, her gaze fixed on the center of the gate. Within that frame, the stars were not distant points of light. They were shifting, rearranging themselves into patterns that defied human geometry. The gate was a window into something vast, a dimension that made the planet feel like a marble in the dark. Cale felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a frantic, rhythmic protest against the stillness. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the realization of their own size. They were ants trapped under a magnifying glass, and the gate was the lens. The sheer scale of the construct pressed against their lungs, forcing them to gasp for air that suddenly tasted sterile and thin. They stood motionless, two ghosts caught in the shadow of an architect they had never known. A psychic hammer struck them both at once. It was not a sound, but a searing infusion of data that bypassed the ears and ignited the mind. Cale fell to his knees, his vision fracturing into 1,000 overlapping perspectives. He saw his own life, the oil-stained hands, the betrayal by Volther, the cold return to the past not as a lived experience, but as a linear progression of variables. A voice, cold and devoid of empathy, resonated within the marrow of his bones. Every tear shed for a lost love, every calculated strike against an enemy, was a calibrated metric. The Order of the Void did not care for their survival. They were merely observers of a closed-loop simulation. Lena gripped her head, her screams silent as the psychic pressure forced her to relive the exact moment of her choice to leave with Valther. She saw it now. The choice was a programmed trigger, designed to test the limits of human resilience. There was no fate, only a sequence of input and response. The love they had clung to, the trauma that had defined their growth, was reduced to a cold, numerical analysis. Cale looked up at the gate, his eyes burning, the truth stripping away the last remnants of his purpose. They were not protagonists in a struggle, they were lab rats in a cage that had finally run out of experiments. The ground beneath them groaned, a low, metallic shriek that vibrated through their souls. Then, the city began to fold. Skyscrapers constructed of steel and glass lost their rigidity, buckling at the foundations like damp paper. Towering spires tipped slowly, not hitting the ground, but dissolving into shimmering streams of light as they touched the horizon. Cale grabbed a rusted railing, his knuckles white as the rooftop tilted 45 degrees. Below them, the slums were being erased. Streets crumbled into static, the neon smog evaporating into thin, colorless air. There was no fire, no explosion, only a systematic deletion of matter. Lina stumbled, her feet sliding across the uneven concrete as the entire skyline bent inward. A massive residential block nearby flattened into a two-dimensional plane, its windows blinking out one by one like dying stars. Gravity shifted, pulling them toward the center of the rift, then suddenly released, leaving them weightless for a heartbeat. Dust and debris hung suspended in the air, then surged upward, drawn into the pulsing violet gate. The horizon was no longer a skyline. It was a jagged, closing mouth. KL looked at the void, then at Lena, as the floorboards beneath them fractured, turning into dust that drifted away into the encroaching nothingness. The world was folding up, and they were the last pieces of refuse to be swept away. The tearing sound of the skies ceased. In its place, a silence so profound it felt like pressure against the eardrums descended upon the rooftop. The violet rift pulled wide, the edges of reality curling back like scorched film. Then, they appeared, massive, circular apertures solidified within the light, vast and unblinking. They were not eyes of flesh, but crystalline spheres that burned with the cold intensity of 1,000 dying suns. As the pupils constricted, focusing downward, the air turned static. Kale felt his pulse hitch. He tried to turn his head, to look away, but his neck muscles locked under the sheer weight of that observation. It was a gaze that did not just see him, it cataloged him. Lena stood paralyzed, her hands trembling at her sides, her face illuminated by the harsh, clinical glow emanating from the rift. The eyes were everywhere, shifting their focus across the remains of the city, stripping away the illusion of their individual agency. Every fear they had ever harbored, every secret ambition that drove them, was laid bare, dissected by that ancient, uncaring stare. There was no room left for defiance. KL looked up, his jaw set, but his resolve withered. They were no longer people. They were specimens under a microscope, waiting for the final decision of a creator that viewed their entire existence as a triviality. The pressure from above intensified, a physical weight that forced them to their knees. KL felt his balance vanish as the rooftop groaned, the concrete fracturing into jagged islands. He lunged to keep his footing, his boots slipping on the slick, eroding surface. 10 feet away, Lena swayed, her arms outstretched, clawing at the empty air for a grip that no longer existed. The gap between them widened as the building split, a chasm of swirling dust and blackness opening beneath their feet. Kale saw the steel rebar beneath the surface snap, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He didn't think. He lunged across the widening fissure. His fingers caught her wrist. She grabbed his forearm, her grip iron hard, pulling him toward her until their bodies collided. They huddled together, not seeking comfort,